Abigail Reed had always known the land would shape her fate, but nothing in her past could have prepared her for the day the wind changed and the world she knew began to unravel. Here, in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Wyoming Territory, the world was governed not by men or laws, but by the silent, powerful breath of the Wind River Range. The mountains stood like ancient, gray sentinels to the west, their peaks scraping a sky so wide and empty it could make a soul feel insignificant. It was a land of harsh truths and little mercy, a place that stripped away all that was unnecessary and left only what was essential for survival. For a year since her father's passing, survival had been Abigail's only creed. The morning broke cold, with a frost that clung to every blade of grass, making the broad valley glitter under the pale light of dawn. Abigail was already at work on the north fence line, the one that bordered the creek. The winter's thaw had heaved a post from the ground, leaving a gap in the barbed wire that was more of an invitation than a barrier. Her hands, though protected by worn leather gloves, were stiff with cold, but her movements were sure and economical. She worked with the quiet competence of someone who had learned their lessons from observation and necessity, not from books. Every swing of the heavy mallet driving the post back into the stubborn earth was a testament to the life she now led, a life measured in solitary chores and the slow turning of the seasons. She did not work with anger or resentment, but with a focused determination that had become her closest companion. The silence was absolute, broken only by the thud of her work and the rush of the nearby creek, its water still numb with melted snow. This silence had been her teacher, her solace, and at times, her tormentor. It had taught her to distinguish the sound of a coyote's tread from that of a deer, to feel the shift in the air that signaled a coming storm, and to listen to the steady, quiet rhythm of her own heart. But in the long, dark hours of the night, it echoed with the ghosts of laughter and a deep, reassuring voice that was no longer there. Her father had been a man of few words, but his presence had filled this land. Now, only she remained, after securing the fence. She made her way along the trap line she had set in the cottonwoods along the water. The second snare held a rabbit, a small victory against the persistent gnawing of hunger. She dispatched it quickly, a grim but necessary task that she performed without flinching. This was the currency of her existence: skill, vigilance, and a willingness to do what must be done. She was not a victim of her circumstances, she was a quiet combatant. Locked in a daily struggle with a land that gave no quarter, her loneliness was not a weakness to be pitied, but a shield she had forged around her heart. Thick and resilient, it kept the fear at bay and allowed her to face each sunrise with resolve. It was late in the afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent behind the jagged peaks, that a new sound drifted toward her on the wind. It was not the familiar call of a hawk or the rustle of an animal in the undergrowth. It was the tired, uneven rhythm of a horse's gait, heavy and labored. Abigail froze, her head lifting, her body instantly alert. Visitors were not a feature of her world. The trail that led to her cabin was little more than a memory, and the nearest town was a 2-day ride for a healthy horse. No one came this way by accident. She slipped the rabbit into her satchel and moved with quiet urgency back toward the cabin, her hand already reaching for the cold, familiar weight of the rifle that rested just inside the door. She stood on the porch, partially concealed by the shadow of the roof, and watched the figure approach. It was a man on horseback. His form slumped in the saddle with an exhaustion so profound it was visible even from a distance. The horse, a bay gelding, favored its front left leg, each step a painful effort. The man wore the dusty, trail-worn clothes of a long-distance rider. His hat pulled low, obscuring his face. He did not ride like a man with purpose, but like one who was simply letting his mount carry him to whatever end awaited. Abigail's grip tightened on the rifle stock. The land had taught her that pity was a luxury she could not afford. He stopped the horse about 50 yards from the cabin, as if sensing the unseen boundary he was about to cross. He sat there for a long moment, before slowly, deliberately, raising one hand, palm open, in a universal sign of peace. Then he dismounted, his movements stiff and weary. Only when his feet were firmly on the ground did Abigail step out from the shadows. The long barrel of the Winchester rifle held steady, its aim unwavering. "That's far enough," she called out, her voice clear and firm, carrying easily in the still air. It was the first time she had spoken to another human being in months, and the sound felt foreign in her own throat. The man did not startle. He simply stopped and slowly removed his hat, revealing a face etched with fatigue and streaked with the dirt of the trail. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with a strong jawline obscured by a rough beard and eyes that were a pale, hollowed-out gray. He held her gaze without aggression or plea, but with a simple, profound stillness. Her father had taught her that you could judge a man by the state of his horse. And this man's horse was clearly suffering, yet it did not look like the result of neglect, but of a shared and brutal misfortune. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, rough sound. "I mean no harm. My horse is lame. We've been without water since yesterday." Abigail's gaze remained fixed on him, her mind a fortress of practiced caution. He was a stranger, armed, and a potential threat to the fragile world she had built. Every instinct screamed at her to send him away, to preserve the solitude that had kept her safe. But as she looked into his face, she saw past the potential danger. She saw a man pushed beyond every known limit. A man so worn down by the world that he had nothing left to fight with. She saw a reflection of the same bone-deep exhaustion she sometimes felt, staring back at her from her own reflection in a dark window pane. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, a rare piece of advice from a man who rarely offered it. "You don't have to trust a man to show him a moment of grace." Abby, sometimes. That's all a person has left to give. It was a risk, a terrible, foolish risk, but to turn him away was to become as merciless as the land itself, a line she was not willing to cross. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the rifle until its barrel pointed at the dusty planks of the porch. The movement felt immense, a seismic shift in the carefully constructed world of her solitude. "There's water at the pump." "By the barn," she said, her voice still cautious, but no longer a challenge. "You can see to your horse. The barn is warm enough. You can stay the night." The man's shoulders seemed to sag with a relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. He did not offer a torrent of thanks, just a single, slow nod of his head. "Much obliged, ma'am," he whispered, and the simple words were filled with a gratitude that no flowery speech could have conveyed. Abigail retreated back into the cabin, closing the door but not barring it. Not yet. She watched through the window as he led his horse with painstaking slowness toward the barn. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man familiar with hardship, his actions deliberate and without waste. He did not look toward the cabin, did not presume upon her charity in any way. He simply accepted the grace he had been offered and set about the business of survival. Later, as darkness fell and the temperature plummeted, she brought him a plate of stewed rabbit and a thick wool blanket. The exchange was conducted in the wide open space in front of the barn, under a sky littered with cold, indifferent stars. He took them with another quiet nod, his eyes briefly meeting hers, and in them, she saw a flicker of life that had not been there before. She returned to her cabin, and this time, she slid the heavy wooden bar across the door. She sat in her father's rocking chair by the cold hearth, the rifle across her lap, listening. The familiar sounds of the night were now joined by new ones, the soft rustle of hay from the barn, the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof. The silence was broken. Her world was no longer entirely her own, and as she sat there in the darkness, she could not decide if she felt more fear or less alone. The first light of morning found Abigail Reed already awake, sitting at her small kitchen table, the rifle cleaned and resting against the wall nearby. Sleep had been a shallow, restless thing, punctuated by the new and foreign awareness of another human presence nearby. For a year, every sound on her land had been familiar, catalogued, and understood. Now, the occasional cough or the soft shuffle of movement from the barn was an intrusion on that solitude, a constant reminder of the risk she had taken. She watched the sun crest the eastern hills, painting the valley in strokes of pale gold, and knew that a decision made in the twilight held a different weight in the stark clarity of day. When she stepped outside into the crisp air, she saw him by the water pump, his back to her. He was not idle. He had a small collection of tools, gleaned from his own saddlebags, laid out neatly on a piece of sackcloth. The pump had been a source of constant frustration for Abigail, its handle stiff, its flow intermittent, a problem her father had always fixed with a skill she had never quite mastered. Now, Silas was studying it with the intense focus of a surgeon, his head cocked as he listened to the groaning protest of the mechanism with each pull of the handle. He worked without being asked, an unspoken acknowledgement of the debt he owed for the shelter and food. Abigail watched him for a long moment from the porch. He moved with a methodical grace, his hands sure and steady as he disassembled the pump's rusted housing. He seemed to understand the language of worn metal and strained mechanics. There was a patient confidence in his labor that she found herself respecting, a stark contrast to her own frantic, often forceful, efforts to tame the homestead. By midday, the sound of his work had changed to a smooth, steady squeak, followed by the gush of clear, uninterrupted water. Uninterrupted. He stayed a second day, and then a third. No words were exchanged about the arrangement. It simply fell into a rhythm that needed no discussion. He was the first to rise, tending to his horse and then moving on to whatever task presented itself. He seemed to possess an uncanny ability to see the homestead's weaknesses, the fraying edges of the world she struggled to hold together. He replaced a loose hinge on the main gate, sharpened her blunted axe blades until they gleamed, and spent an entire afternoon clearing rocks from the small plot she hoped to turn into a vegetable garden come spring. He ate the meals she left for him on the porch, and each evening, he returned to the seclusion of the barn. Their days became a partnership forged in shared labor rather than conversation. They would often work on opposite ends of the property, aware of each other's presence only as a distant figure moving against the vast landscape. But sometimes, their tasks brought them closer. One afternoon, she was struggling with the old mule, a creature as stubborn and unyielding as the rocky soil itself. It refused to be harnessed, its eyes rolling with a wild, recalcitrant spirit, her patience, already worn thin by the 1,000 daily struggles of her life, finally broke. Silas, who had been splitting logs nearby, set down his axe and approached slowly. He did not speak to her, but to the mule. His voice was low and steady, a calming murmur that seemed to cut through the animal's panic. He stood near it for a long time, not trying to force the harness, but simply letting his steady presence be known. He extended a hand and let the mule nuzzle it, his movements slow and predictable. After a few minutes of this nonverbal communion, he picked up the harness, and the mule stood placidly as he buckled it into place. He gave the animal a final, gentle pat before turning to Abigail. "He's just lonely," Silas said, his gaze fixed on the mule. "Things get mean when they're left alone too long." It was the most he had said to her at one time, and the words hung in the air between them, heavy with a meaning that went far beyond the stubbornness of an old animal. As the days bled into a week, the atmosphere between them began to change from watchful to comfortable. They began to share their evening meals on the porch steps, the stew pot between them, the setting sun casting long shadows across the valley. It was during one of these tranquil evenings that a piece of his past slipped out. As unnoticed as a stone dislodged from a cliff face, she had asked him, her voice barely a whisper, where he had learned to fix so many things. He was whittling a piece of wood, his knife moving in smooth, practice strokes. He shrugged, not looking up from his work. You pick things up. When you're always moving, you have to learn to be your own blacksmith, your own carpenter. He paused, his eyes lifting to the far horizon, where the sky was turning a deep, bruised purple. Haven't stopped moving much. Not since the war. The word hung in the air. War. It explained the hollowness in his eyes, the haunted stillness that clung to him like a second skin. It was a door to a past she knew she should not try to open. She merely nodded, accepting the small, heavy piece of himself he had offered. In return, she found herself sharing a piece of her own. My father built this cabin, she said, her hand resting on the rough-hewn log of the porch. He said the land doesn't care about your past. It only asks what you're willing to build on it today. That's why I've stayed. It's the only place I've ever felt anchored. The emotional peak of this fragile, budding connection came unexpectedly. The handle on her heaviest sledgehammer had cracked, a dangerous flaw in a vital tool. Silas had insisted on mending it, using his skills to shape a new handle from a piece of seasoned hickory. He worked by the fading light of the lantern in the barn, the air growing cool around them. Abigail held the heavy hammerhead steady while he fitted the new handle. His brow furrowed in concentration. Hold it there, he murmured, his voice low. He reached across to make a final adjustment, and as he did, the back of his hand brushed against hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through Abigail that was as sharp and stunning as a spark from a flint. It was the first human touch she had felt in over a year, a sudden, overwhelming reminder of a world of warmth and connection she had long since buried. She drew her hand back as if burned. He did the same, a flicker of surprise in his own eyes. They stood in the lantern light, the space between them suddenly charged and heavy with everything that had not been said. He cleared his throat and went back to his work, but the easy, unspoken understanding between them had been irrevocably altered, replaced by a new and thrillingly dangerous awareness. The turning point came 2 weeks after his arrival. The need for flour and salt finally drove Abigail to make the long ride to the remote trading post that served as the area's only link to the outside world. It was less a town than a single dilapidated building huddled against the vast emptiness. She returned late the next day with her supplies and a single piece of mail, a letter forwarded from the land office in Cheyenne. She opened it on the porch, her heart sinking as she read the dense, legalistic text. It was a formal notice, a warning to all settlers in the valley, a powerful cattle baron, backed by investors from the east, was using old surveys and legal loopholes to challenge existing land claims, consolidating vast tracts of territory for his herds. The letter advised landowners to ensure their deeds were unassailable. She folded the paper, a cold dread seeping into her bones. Her father's deed was sound. She knew it was. But the letter spoke of powerful men and subtle tactics, of a fight she had no idea how to wage. She looked up from the page, her gaze sweeping across the land that was her entire world, the sturdy cabin, the quiet barn, the creek glittering in the sun. And then she saw him. Silas was walking up from the creek, a string of fish in one hand, his posture straight and steady. He was no longer the broken man who had stumbled out of the wilderness. He was a part of this place now, his presence as solid and real as the mountains behind him. In that moment, a profound realization struck her. The thought of facing this new, faceless threat alone was suddenly unbearable. The shield of her loneliness, once her greatest strength, now felt like a fragile, inadequate defense. She had grown accustomed to the steady support of his presence, to the wordless partnership that had made her burdens feel lighter. His presence had become more than just helpful. It had become essential. She waited until he had cleaned the fish and they were sitting on the porch. The coming evening casting a calm glow over the land, the letter felt like a lead weight in her pocket. She knew what she had to do, knew the risk she was about to take was far greater than offering a stranger a place to sleep. She was offering him a piece of her life. "Silas," she began, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. He looked at her, his expression patient and questioning. "The arrangement we have, it has been fair. You have more than ever earned your keep." She paused, gathering her courage. "But my circumstances have changed. I have a fight on my hands. It seems—" She handed him the letter. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. When he was done, he folded it carefully and handed it back to her, his eyes meeting hers. "Cattle barons," he said, the words flat. "They don't fight fair." "I know," she said. "I can't offer you wages to stay and help me fight it. I have almost nothing to offer at all." She took a deep breath. "But I'm not looking for a hired hand anymore. I'm offering you a place to stand. A home. If you'll have it." The offer hung in the twilight air, a raw and honest plea. It was a confession of her need, an admission of her vulnerability, and a testament to the trust he had quietly earned. He did not answer immediately. He looked away from her, out at the vast, darkening land, at the mountains that stood indifferent to the small. Human dramas played out at their feet. Abigail waited, her entire world balanced on the precipice of his answer. Silas held Abigail's gaze for a long moment, the twilight air growing cooler around them, thick with the weight of her offer. The mountains behind him were now hulking silhouettes against a sky bleeding its last light. For years, his life had been a study in subtraction, of shedding places and people to keep moving, to outrun the ghost that rode at his back. To accept her offer was to do the opposite. It was an act of addition, of anchoring himself to a person and a piece of land, inviting the very complications he had spent a decade avoiding. He looked from her determined, vulnerable face to the sturdy cabin, then back again. He had come here seeking nothing but a moment's rest, and now he was being offered a reason to stay. He gave a single, slow nod, the movement barely perceptible in the deepening gloom. "All right, Abigail," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I'll stay." He didn't say more, but the weight of those 3 words settled between them. A foundation laid. It was not a promise of victory, but a promise of presence. For Abigail, it was more than enough. A tension she hadn't realized she was holding in her shoulders finally eased, and for the first time that day. She allowed herself to breathe. They had a fight on their hands, but now she was not alone. The arrival of the man who gave that fight a face came 3 days later. He did not look like a villain from a dime novel. He rode a fine black stallion with a gleaming saddle, and his clothes were those of a city gentleman, a tailored tweed coat, polished boots, and a clean, wide-brimmed hat. He rode up to the cabin not with the swagger of a hired gun, but with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed the world was his to claim. He dismounted and tethered his horse to the fence with a calm, proprietary air, as if he were merely inspecting a property he already owned. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice smooth and educated as he approached the porch where Abigail and Silas stood waiting. He removed his hat, revealing a clean-shaven face and shrewd, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Bartholomew Thorne. I represent the Wyoming Cattle and Development Company." He smiled, a thin, polite expression that did not reach his eyes. His gaze flickered between Abigail and Silas, a silent calculation taking place. And you must be Miss Reed. I've come to discuss a matter of great importance to your future. He was invited inside, an act of civility that felt like a strategic error the moment he crossed the threshold. His presence seemed to shrink the small cabin, his clean, citified scent of soap and leather overwhelming the familiar smell of wood smoke and pine. He laid a leather folio on the table and opened it with a flourish, revealing a series of maps and official-looking documents covered in intricate script. "Our company," Thorne began, his tone patient, as if explaining a simple concept to a child, "has recently acquired the titles to a significant portion of this valley. According to the original territorial survey of 1868, the plot registered to your late father, a Mr. Jebediah Reed, contains a significant surveying error. The boundary line, you see, was misdrawn. This cabin, and indeed the majority of this land, actually falls within the parcel legally deeded to us." He slid a map across the table. It was a dizzying web of lines and measurements that meant nothing to Abigail, but the bold red line that cut directly through her property was clear enough. It was a clean, brutal amputation. A lie. She felt a cold fury rise within her, but she held her tongue, her knuckles white where she gripped the back of a chair. "Now," Thorne continued, leaning back with a sigh of feigned sympathy, "we are not unreasonable people. We understand this must come as a shock. So, in the interest of a smooth transition, the company has authorized me to make you a generous offer. We will pay you $200 for your quitclaim on the remaining acreage and for any improvements you have made. Such as this cabin. It is more than fair, I assure you, and it will allow you to relocate without undue hardship." Silas, who had remained silent in the corner of the room, spoke for the first time, his voice a low rumble. $200 for land with a cabin and a year-round creek. That's not a generous offer. It's an insult. Thorne's polite mask tightened almost imperceptibly. His eyes shifted to Silas, dismissing him as one would a piece of furniture. "And you are?" "He stays with me," Abigail said, her voice sharp. "This is my land. My father's deed is filed and legal. It was never challenged." But that is where you are mistaken." "Miss Reed," Thorne said, his voice losing some of its silky texture, "it is being challenged now." "You can, of course, attempt to fight our claim in court, but litigation is a costly and time-consuming affair. I have the finest surveyors and lawyers from Cheyenne at my disposal. You have, well, you have a strong sense of sentiment. I do not recommend you mistake that for a legal defense. We will give you 1 week to consider our offer. After that, we will proceed with a formal eviction notice." He stood, placed his hat back on his head, and gave them a final, chillingly pleasant nod. "I do hope you'll make the wise choice." After he left, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the cabin. The legal papers he'd left on the table seemed to poison the very air. Abigail felt a wave of helpless rage wash over her. Thorne was right. She had nothing but her conviction, and she knew that would count for little against a man like him. She looked at Silas, expecting to see the old, familiar weariness in his eyes, the look of a man ready to move on before trouble could take root. Instead, she saw a quiet, simmering anger that mirrored her own. "He's lying," Silas said. "That map could be anything. We need to go to town. We need to see the official records at the land office for ourselves." The 2-day ride to Red Creek was a tense, mostly silent journey. The unspoken threat of Thorne's deadline loomed over them, a storm cloud on the horizon. Red Creek was a raw, chaotic town, a single muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings, saloons, and a handful of businesses that catered to cowboys, prospectors, and the few hardy settlers in the region. It was a place of noise and strangers, a world away from the quiet solitude of the homestead, and it set Abigail's teeth on edge. The clerk at the land office was a harried, ink-stained man who seemed overwhelmed by his own ledgers. After a long search, he produced the territorial survey maps. There, in the official records, was the same brutal red line they had seen on Thorne's copy. It was real. A knot of ice formed in Abigail's stomach. The clerk offered no help, only a shrug. Legal challenges were matters for the circuit judge. He explained, and the judge wasn't due for another 3 months. By then, winter would have set in, and Thorne would have already won. Defeated. They stepped out of the office and into the harsh afternoon sun. The street was crowded, a river of rough-looking men. As they made their way toward the general store, a man stumbled out of a nearby saloon, his face flushed with whiskey. He stopped, his eyes narrowing as he focused on Silas. He was a big man, with a thick beard and a missing arm. The sleeve of his Union Army coat pinned neatly at the shoulder. "Well, I'll be," the man slurred. His voice loud enough to turn heads. He took a step forward, planting himself in Silas's path. "I know you, Vicksburg. You're one of them damn Johnny Rebs." The street seemed to fall quiet around them. People stopped, turning to watch. Silas froze, his body going rigid, his face becoming an unreadable mask. The past he had ridden so far to escape had just caught up to him in the middle of a muddy street. "You Rebs killed my brother," the veteran spat, his voice thick with an old, bitter hatred. "Ran like yellow dogs when we pushed through. What's a traitor like you doing in decent territory?" A murmur went through the assembling crowd. Faces turned from curious to hostile. Abigail felt a cold fear grip her, a fear different from the one Thorne had inspired. This was older, uglier. She saw Silas's hands clench into fists at his sides, saw the instinct to flee warring with the instinct to fight in his tense shoulders. She saw him preparing to be alone again, to be cast out. In that moment, something inside Abigail shifted. This was not about a war she had never known or a past she did not understand. This was about the man who had fixed her pump, who had calmed her mule, who had stayed, without a second thought. She moved from his side and stepped directly in front of him, facing the one-armed veteran. Then, she turned her back on the accuser and the hostile crowd, reached behind her, and took Silas's arm in her hand. She did not say a word. She simply stood with him, her grip firm, her posture defiant. It was a silent, unshakable declaration. He is with me. His past is his. But his present is here. The crowd stared, momentarily confused by the young woman's fierce, quiet loyalty. The veteran, taken aback, seemed to lose the thread of his drunken rage. The moment was broken. Abigail kept her hold on Silas's arm and gently pulled him forward, leading him through the parted sea of onlookers. They didn't speak until they were back with the horses. In the relative quiet of the livery stable, the weight of what had just happened was immense. Silas leaned against a post, his breathing heavy, as if he had just run for miles. He looked at his hands, then at Abigail, and his eyes were no longer empty. They were filled with a raw, complex emotion she had never seen before. The wall he had built around himself had been breached. Not by the hatred of a stranger, but by the loyalty of a near stranger. He finally pushed himself off the post and stood before her. The drifter was gone. The man running from his past was gone. In his place stood someone who had just been given a reason to stop. "They'll never see me as anything else," he said, his voice rough. "To them, I'll always be the man who wore a gray coat." He looked directly into her eyes, and she saw the last of his hesitation fall away. "Thorne, the land office, this town. This is your fight, but you won't fight it alone." The ride back from Red Creek was steeped in a new kind of silence. It was no longer the quiet of two solitary people sharing a space, but the focused, charged silence of allies preparing for war. The week Thorn had given them was a ticking clock, each sunset a turn of a page toward a final confrontation. They did not waste time on fear or speculation. Instead, they spent their days in labor, not just maintaining the homestead, but transforming it. Their work was now imbued with a grim purpose. Every action a preparation for the coming siege. The sky overhead seemed to mirror their mood, the brilliant, sharp blue of early autumn giving way to a muted, heavy gray that promised the season's first snow. That promise was their unconventional and most powerful weapon. Abigail, who knew the land as she knew the lines on her own hands, became the strategist. She walked the perimeter of her property with Silas, pointing out not areas of beauty, but areas of weakness and opportunity. The ground here is soft, especially after a rain, she'd say, indicating a low-lying patch of ground near the creek. A horse would get bogged down to its knees. She showed him the game trails, the narrow, hidden paths through the dense aspen groves, and the steep, unstable shale slopes on the far side of the valley. Places her father had always warned her to avoid. This land, her sanctuary, was about to become a fortress, and she was its architect. Silas listened intently, his soldier's mind translating her intimate knowledge into tactical possibilities. The ghosts of his past, once a source of torment, were now repurposed. He saw the terrain not as a homesteader, but as he had once seen the battlefields around Vicksburg, a landscape of choke points, sight lines, and defensive positions. He was no longer running from what the war had made him. He was using it to defend the first home he'd had in a decade. Together, they devised a defense built not on firepower but on cunning, exhaustion, and the land itself. Their plan was to make Thorn's invasion so costly in time and energy that the coming blizzard would become his true enemy. They spent the final days setting their silent, non-lethal traps. They felled a half-rotted log across a narrow trail, weakening it just enough to collapse under the weight of a horse. They dug a shallow, mud-filled trench in the soft ground Abigail had pointed out, covering it with a thin layer of branches and leaves. They rigged tripwires in the dense thickets, not to snares, but to piles of empty cans that would raise a clattering alarm, shattering the nerves of anyone trying to approach unseen. It was a defense of 1,000 small frustrations, designed to bleed the will of their opponents before any real confrontation took place. On the 7th day, they came. The sky was a uniform, oppressive sheet of gray, and the air was unnaturally still. Holding its breath, Thorn was accompanied by 4 men, hard-faced riders with the cold, practical look of men who worked for wages and asked few questions. They rode with an arrogant confidence, spreading out as they approached the cabin, expecting to find 2 terrified settlers ready to surrender. Thorn halted his horse and hailed the cabin, his voice carrying the same infuriating politeness as before. "Miss Reed, I have returned for your answer. I trust you have come to a reasonable decision." The answer came not in words, but in the resolute silence from the cabin. After a long moment, Thorn's patience snapped. He gave a curt nod to 2 of his men, who spurred their horses forward, intending to approach from the west. Through the woods, they disappeared into the dense grove of aspens, and for a few minutes, there was only the sound of the wind sighing through the bare branches. Then, a sudden, jarring clangor of metal echoed from the woods, followed by a string of curses. The diversion had worked. Thorn, his face darkening with irritation, sent his other 2 men on a wide flanking maneuver to the east. While he decided to proceed with a direct approach, he dismounted, leaving his horse behind, and began to walk toward the cabin. His movements cautious but determined. He was a man accustomed to control, and this silent, invisible resistance was clearly beginning to unnerve him. This was the moment Silas had been waiting for, while Abigail kept watch from a window, rifle in hand. Silas slipped out the back of the barn, moving like a shadow along the creek bed, his path completely hidden from view. He circled around, his movements swift and silent, a ghost from another life. He positioned himself behind a rocky outcrop that overlooked the path Thorn was taking. He had the man dead in his sights. The rifle felt cold and familiar in his hands. Every instinct honed in the crucible of war screamed at him to pull the trigger. It was the logical move, the one that would end the threat, the one that would eliminate the leader and send the others scattering. His finger tightened on the trigger, the cold metal a temptation. But in that sliver of a second, it was not the face of an enemy he saw, but Abigail's. Her expression fierce and loyal as she stood before the hostile crowd in Red Creek. He was not a soldier in a gray coat anymore, fighting for a lost cause. He was a man fighting for a woman who had offered him a home. He was fighting for the quiet evenings on the porch, for the shared meals, for the chance at a life he had long believed was impossible. The man he was now would not take a life to preserve his own. He lowered the rifle, with the stealth of a predator. He closed the distance between them. Thorn, so focused on the cabin ahead, never heard him approach. Silas burst from behind the rocks, not with a weapon, but with the full force of his body. He tackled Thorn, sending them both tumbling to the hard ground. The air rushed from Thorn's lungs in a surprised gasp, before the man could recover or reach for the pistol at his belt. Silas was on him, one hand pinning his arms while the other wrenched the gun from its holster. He tossed it far into the thick brush. "We're not killing men today," Silas said, his voice low and hard as he hauled Thorn to his feet. At that moment, the first snowflake drifted down from the gray sky. Then another. And another. The timing was perfect. The two men who had been sent into the woods finally emerged, scratched and flustered, having been led in circles by a cleverly laid false trail. The other two, returning from the east, were covered in mud, their horses struggling after being mired in the hidden trench. They saw their leader, disarmed and held captive, and hesitated, unsure of their next move. This was the signal. From his vantage point, Silas gave a sharp whistle, high up on the unstable shale slope overlooking the main trail. Abigail, who had moved into position, threw her entire weight against a long, heavy log they had wedged under a key rock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan, the rock shifted. A cascade of smaller stones began to tumble, gathering speed and mass, until the entire slope gave way in a deafening roar. A river of rock and earth poured down, completely blocking the trail, severing the only easy path of retreat. The snow, which had begun as a gentle flurry, now transformed into a thick, swirling curtain, the wind rising with a sudden, mournful howl. The world was rapidly dissolving into a blur of white. Thorn stared in disbelief at the impassable rockslide, then at the blizzard that was descending upon them with ferocious speed. His face, for the first time, showed a flicker of genuine fear. His hired men looked at each other, their bravado gone, replaced by the primal urgency of survival. Their fight was no longer with the settlers. It was with the indifferent, lethal power of a Wyoming winter. Without another word, Thorn turned and scrambled away, his men following close behind. Their only thought now to find shelter before the storm buried them? They were defeated, not by bullets or bloodshed, but by a deep understanding of the land and a refusal to bow to a bully's threats. Abigail made her way down from the slope, her face flushed with adrenaline and the biting cold. She joined Silas, and together they stood and watched as the figures of their enemies were swallowed by the storm. The wind whipped around them, pulling at their clothes. But they stood firm, two small figures against the immense, wild power of the landscape. The homestead was safe. They had faced the challenge and held their ground. The silence that returned was not one of loneliness or fear, but of hard-won, breathless victory. The wind howled, a physical presence that seemed to want to tear the world from its foundations. The victory they had just secured felt distant and fragile in the face of the storm's immense power. A shared, unspoken understanding passed between them. Their fight had transitioned from one against men to one against the elements. Silas took Abigail's arm, his grip firm and grounding amidst the chaos, and guided her toward the relative safety of the barn to secure the livestock before seeking refuge themselves. The mule and her 2 cows were already huddled together, their eyes wide with animal instinct. Together, they barred the heavy doors, the sound of the wind instantly muffled to a deep, resonant roar inside the small, warm space of the cabin. The world shrank to the flickering circle of lamplight and the steady crackle of the fire in the hearth. The blizzard erased the landscape, replacing the valley, the mountains, and the sky with a swirling vortex of white. They were sealed off, adrift in a sea of snow. The adrenaline from the confrontation began to fade, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and the dull ache of bruises they hadn't noticed they'd acquired without a word. Abigail brought out a basin of warm water and a tin of her father's medicinal salve. She tended to a long scrape on Silas's forearm, her touch gentle and focused. He, in turn, cleaned a cut on her cheek where a stray branch had struck her as she scrambled down the slope. This quiet act of tending to each other's wounds was more intimate than any conversation they had yet shared. It was a physical acknowledgement of their shared battle, a silent confirmation that they had protected each other and would continue to do so. In the small, flickering space between them, the last vestiges of their former lives as solitary strangers finally dissolved, burned away by the heat of the fire and the shared experience of the day. The storm raged for 3 days. Time lost its meaning, measured not by the sun, but by the rhythm of their new domestic life. They fell into a routine dictated by necessity, keeping the fire fed, melting snow for water, sharing the dwindling supply of smoked meat and potatoes. The cabin, once a symbol of Abigail's lonely independence, became a shared sanctuary. The tight quarters forced a new proximity, an easy familiarity that grew in the spaces between their quiet chores. They learned the cadence of each other's breathing, the way the firelight caught in the other's eyes, the comfortable silence of 2 people who no longer needed words to understand one another. On the 3rd night, the blizzard reached its peak. The wind shrieked like a tormented spirit, and the small cabin shuddered under the weight of the accumulated snow. The world outside had ceased to exist. They sat before the hearth, the fire casting dancing shadows on the log walls, creating the illusion that they were the only 2 people left alive. The intensity of the storm seemed to strip away all remaining defenses, leaving only the raw, honest truth of who they were. It was Silas who spoke first, his voice a low murmur against the roar of the wind. He was staring into the flames, but his gaze was turned inward, looking at a landscape far more desolate than the one outside. "My brother, Caleb," he began, the name feeling heavy and strange on his tongue after years of silence. He was younger than me, full of fire and foolish ideas about glory. When the war started, I told myself I was enlisting to look after him. But the truth is, I couldn't have stopped him if I'd tried. Abigail listened, her hands still in her lap. Sensing this was a story that had been locked away for a very long time, he thought it was all a grand adventure. Silas continued, his voice rough with memory. He never saw the danger, only the cause. At Vicksburg, things were bad. It wasn't glorious. It was just mud and fear and the noise, a constant, deafening noise. We got separated from our company during a charge. It was chaos. He got hit. I tried to get to him, but I was a soldier. I had my orders. I was supposed to keep moving forward. He paused, his throat working. I hesitated for just a second. When I looked back, he was gone, swallowed up by the smoke and the confusion. I survived the battle. I survived the war. But I left him there. He finally turned to look at her. His eyes filled with a pain so profound it made her heart ache. I've been asking myself the same question every day for 10 years. Why me? Why did the cautious one who just wanted to get home survive? While the brave one who believed in something was lost, I started wandering because standing still meant I'd have to face the answer. I figured if I kept moving, I could outrun the ghost of the man I should have been. The confession filled the small cabin, a story of guilt and loss that was almost as powerful as the storm outside. Abigail felt her own carefully constructed walls begin to crumble in the face of his raw vulnerability. She thought of her own ghost, the one she lived with every day. When my father died, she said. Her voice soft but clear. It happened right here, in this room. One minute he was here, solid and real, and the next, he was just gone. I was so terrified, not just of being alone, but of failing him, this land, this cabin. It was all he had, all he built. I thought if I lost it, it would be like losing him all over again. That's why I held on so tight. My strength, it was just fear wearing a different coat. They looked at each other. Two souls laid bare by the intimacy of the firelight and the fury of the storm. All the secrets, all the carefully guarded pains that had defined them as individuals, were now shared between them. The soldier running from his guilt and the daughter terrified of failure were gone, replaced by just a man and a woman who truly saw each other for the first time. Silas reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek where the cut had been. The simple, tender gesture was an answer to every unspoken question, a balm on a wound far deeper than any physical scrape. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away, but she did not move. She met him halfway. The kiss was not a spark of sudden passion, but the quiet, inevitable meeting of two rivers that had been flowing toward the same sea. It was gentle, full of a deep, unspoken reverence. It tasted of wood smoke, and sorrow, and the promise of a new morning. It was not the taking of a prize, but the offering of a gift. It was the culmination of every shared meal, every silent understanding, every danger faced together. It was a promise, made in the heart of a winter storm, to stop surviving separately and start building a life together. When they parted, they rested their foreheads against each other. The blizzard still howled outside, but inside the cabin, a profound and peaceful quiet had settled. The war was over, the fight was done, and in the warm, safe space they had defended and now shared, they had finally truly found their way home. Abigail Reed learned that winter, that peace, had a sound. It was the sound of two people breathing in the quiet of a snowbound cabin, the gentle pop and hiss of a well-tended fire, and the steady, reassuring beat of another's heart next to her own in the deep, silent hours of the night. The blizzard that had sealed them off from the world became their sanctuary, a crucible in which two broken halves of two separate lives were forged into a single, stronger whole. When the storm finally broke and the sun emerged, casting a brilliant, almost blinding light upon the transformed landscape, it was not just the world that had been reborn, but the people within it. Spring came slowly at first, then all at once. The snow retreated from the valley floor, lingering only on the highest, shaded slopes of the Wind River Range. The creek, freed from its icy prison, swelled into a cheerful, boisterous current, its voice a celebration of life's return. The land, washed clean, began to breathe again, the scent of damp earth and new growth filling the air. Abigail and Silas moved with the season, their lives shifting from the inward focus of winter survival to the outward energy of planting and rebuilding. They worked side by side, a seamless and unspoken partnership. News of the world outside their valley trickled in months later, carried by a traveling fur trapper. Bartholomew Thorne and the Wyoming Cattle and Development Company had withdrawn their claims. The battle they had faced, the cost in time and resources, coupled with the brutal reputation of a Wyoming winter, had convinced the investors in the East that there were easier lands to conquer. Thorn never returned. He became a ghost, a half-forgotten story, his threat fading into nothing more than a bad memory against the vibrant, undeniable reality of the life they were now building. His defeat was not marked by a celebration, but by the quiet, steady work of their hands. Their love story was written not in whispered words or grand declarations, but in the shared language of labor. It was in the way Silas's hands guided the plow while Abigail followed behind, dropping seeds into the rich, dark earth of the new garden plot. It was in the easy rhythm they found while repairing the section of roof damaged by the heavy snow. Passing shingles and hammer back and forth without a word, he was no longer a guest in the barn or a temporary fixture in her life. When he began digging the foundation for a new room to be added to the cabin, it was a quiet, solid statement. He was not just staying, he was building, expanding their small world to make space for a future. He taught her how to properly sight a rifle, how to read the clouds for a coming change in weather. She, in turn, taught him the names of the wildflowers that painted the meadows and the secrets of her father's sourdough starter. The ghosts of their past did not vanish entirely, sorrow of that depth never does, but they receded. The ghost of Caleb, Silas's brother, was no longer a specter of guilt to be outrun, but a quiet memory honored by the peace Silas had finally found. The ghost of Abigail's father was no longer a standard of lonely resilience she felt she had to live up to, but a warm, approving presence that she felt watching over the home he had built. Now filled with life once more, the seasons turned, each one leaving its mark not just on the land, but on the two people who tended it. The vibrant green of summer deepened into the gold of autumn, and the quiet white of winter returned, no longer as a threat, but as a time for rest and closeness. They watched the years layer themselves upon the valley, adding rings to the trees and a deeper sense of peace to their own hearts. The cabin grew with them, the new room a testament to their shared future. The garden expanded, the fences stood strong, and the small homestead, once a bastion of solitude, became an anchor of shared existence. One evening, many years later, they sat together on the porch, a place that had witnessed every stage of their journey. The sun was setting, casting a warm, honeyed light across the valley and setting the peaks of the Wind River Range ablaze with color. The air was filled with the gentle hum of twilight. Abigail, her hair now streaked with silver, leaned her head against Silas's shoulder. His arm was wrapped securely around her, a familiar and comforting weight. A few feet away, a small boy with his father's quiet, observant gray eyes and his mother's stubborn chin was meticulously arranging a line of smooth river stones along a porch plank. The scene was one of profound, unadorned peace, a quiet tapestry woven from thousands of ordinary days. It was the life they had earned, not the one they had expected. It was a life built on the foundations of a chance encounter, a shared struggle, and a choice to stand firm when it would have been easier to run. Abigail watched her son for a long moment, a soft smile touching her lips. Then, she turned her face slightly, her cheek resting against the worn fabric of Silas's shirt. "Still thinking of moving on?" she asked. Her voice a low, gentle murmur, a loving callback to the wandering man he had once been. Silas did not answer right away. He tightened his hold on her, his gaze fixed on the mountains as they stood guard over the valley. He looked at the sturdy home they had built, at the boy who was their future, and at the woman who was his anchor. He had traveled half a continent to escape his past, only to find everything he never knew he was searching for in this one small, protected corner of the world. He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to the top of her head. "Never again," he said, his voice warm and certain, filled with the quiet conviction of a truth learned deep in the soul. "I'm home."